The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze, and he was armored with a coat of mail. He had greaves of bronze on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of Jesse, who had 8 sons. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. David was the youngest, and David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Jesse said to his son David, "Take for your brothers this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers." David rose early in the morning, left someone in charge of the sheep, and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, Goliath came out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. All the Israelis, when they saw the man, fled from him and were very much afraid. David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine?" His eldest brothers heard him talking to the men, and his anger was kindled against David. He said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left the sheep in the wilderness?" David said, "What have I done now? It was only a question." David turned toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David with his armor, but David said, "I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones and put them in his shepherd's bag, his sling, was in his hand. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him and said, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. This very day God will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down." When the Philistine drew near to David, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
The Philistine soldiers assembled on one hill, and the Hebrew soldiers took their position on the opposing hill. There was a valley between them. The soldiers on each side were sharpening their swords and knives and spears. There was a tense atmosphere. Then out from the Philistine ranks steps a giant of a man. The Hebrews couldn't believe what they were seeing. He called himself Goliath, and he was a fearsome sight. He stood 9 feet tall and crushed the scales at 450 pounds. His long, wavy black hair covered his shoulders. A deep black beard hid his neck. His arms were the size of most men's legs, his chest almost as wide as a doorway. When he walked, you could feel the earth tremor. His speech was more like a growl, and he had such a fiery temper that no one was at ease in his presence. He excelled in belligerence, and cruelty to people and animals was, he thought, his utmost trait. His path was littered with the bodies of men he had vanquished, and since he brandished few scars himself, he believed himself invincible. Now, while the eyes of the Hebrew people are bugging out at this mountain of a man, he bellows across the valley to them, "Put out your best warrior, and we will fight. If he wins, we will become your slaves, but if I win, you will become our slaves." King Saul and the soldiers were frightened by his words. Terrified, they lost all hope. Have you ever found yourself in a similar spot, facing a giant and scared to death? Some of you know the terror of losing a job and not knowing if you'll ever be able to get another good one. Life is going along just fine, you're paying your bills, you're taking care of your family, and then everything is jerked out from beneath you. It can be terrifying. Some of you know the panic of being told you might have a serious illness. You're cruising along through life feeling vibrant and alive, and suddenly you're told you may have a dreaded disease. You stay awake night after night. Some of you know the fear of believing that you won't be able to survive the death of your loved one. You're scared that the despair may just drag you under. A friend of mine in Virginia died because of her fear. She was afraid of doctors and hospitals, so she avoided them at all costs. Throughout her life, she refused to get physicals. When she was 49, she noticed a tiny lump on her chest. She didn't tell anyone about it. Over the months, it continued to grow. Finally, one day, her husband spotted it and forced her to go to the doctor. Sure enough, it was cancer. She had to have surgery immediately. I was there in the waiting room when the doctor came out after surgery and said, "We just couldn't get it all. If she'd only told us when she first noticed it, we could have saved her life." Her fear of doctors and hospitals and surgery cost her her life. Each morning and evening for 40 days, Goliath stepped forward and made his speech. The Hebrews were so paralyzed that they could not think of any way to respond. Some of the troops were beginning to whisper among themselves, "Let's just avoid the bloodshed. Let's put our weapons down. We'll surrender." Enter a shepherd boy named David. His 3 older brothers were soldiers in the Hebrew army. He was tending sheep. One day he took leave of tending the sheep and took food to his 3 older siblings. And while he was among them and among those other soldiers, Goliath ushered forth and roared his daily challenge. And when David heard it, something stirred within him. Something prompted him to believe that he was the one to take on Goliath. He rushed over to King Saul and said, "I'm your man." If we had been there, I suppose we would have seen the smirk on King Saul's face when he began to say, "Sonny boy?" But that only riled David up all the more. He told Saul about his fierce spirit, how he had taken on these other attackers of his sheep, how not one predator had ever taken a sheep. He was very adept with his sling. He was as brave as they come. With no better alternative, Saul finally says, "Have at it, and may God be with you." David marched toward Goliath, and now it was Goliath that had the disbelieving eyes. "A boy? You send out a boy? I will make him meal for the birds." "Don't count on it," David said. "I'll give you one last chance to surrender." Goliath had had enough of the nonsense and marched toward David to display his cutlery skills. But while Goliath was thundering toward David, he slipped a stone into his sling, and he flung it with tremendous velocity and pinpoint accuracy. It struck Goliath between the eyes. He never knew what hit him. He crumpled to the ground, and David borrowed Goliath's own sword to finish the deed. Now, whether or not this story describes a factual account in young David's life, it carries a truth that has inspired countless number of people for centuries. God is on the side of the one who stands up for what is right and has the guts to take on the dark powers despite the odds. You may be abused. You may not see the victory in your own lifetime. But if you're on God's side, you're on the right side of history. You may know the story of Dr. Bennett Omalu, who came to the U.S. from Nigeria when he did his residency at Columbia Hospital in New York. He became a forensic pathologist at the Allegheny County Coroner's Office. In 2002, he performed an autopsy on a 50-year-old man who had been found dead in his pickup truck. The man was Mike Webster, the Hall of Fame center for the Pittsburgh Steelers. A few years after his playing days had ended, he began hearing voices, experiencing pain, and having severe mental issues. He began to self-mutilate and ended up homeless. Dr. Amalu was puzzled by all this. How could a man so healthy in his 40s deteriorate so rapidly? When Amalu examined the slides of Webster's brain under a microscope, he discovered that he had severe brain damage. He determined it was the result of the continuous head trauma Webster had felt and suffered on the football field. The doctor published his findings in a medical journal. Being from another country and not understanding America's intoxication with football, he naively thought that once the National Football League understood what was happening to the players, they'd do something about it. But of course, the NFL, aka Goliath, dismissed his findings and launched a smear campaign to discredit the doctor. Fans started making threatening phone calls to his house, told him to go back to Africa, pressured him to drop his research into traumatic brain injury. He could have let it go and just let his life revert to normal. Or he could take on Goliath. He is a person of faith, and he found the strength to continue his crusade to expose the terrible damage that was shortening the lives of so many football players. Over the next 3 years, Dr. Amalu did studies over 3 other players who died with very similar symptoms to Webster. The evidence continued to mount. More and more players started experiencing cognitive problems, and the NFL finally relented. It reached a huge financial settlement with the players' union. It changed the rules of the game, so striking with the head was no longer permissible. Any player that now has what appears to be a concussion in a game is done for the day. And the player cannot resume any contact for days until a doctor gives the okay. Just about everyone in this country is now much more aware of the damage done by concussions, all because one man knew he could save people's lives if he had the courage to stand up to Goliath. Throughout the scriptures, we find over and over 4 little words. Do not be afraid. God assured Abraham, first book of the Bible, that he did not have to fight his battles solely with his own strength. When he was facing difficulties in life, he needed to know God was with him, and God said, do not be afraid. God spoke these same words to Hagar and Moses when they were facing a challenge that threatened to overwhelm them. Do not be afraid. We also find these words on the lips of the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, and Ezekiel. When the people faced an obstacle, the prophet would say to the people, do not be afraid. At the very beginning of the Gospels, when Joseph is getting ready to marry his betrothed, he finds out Mary is pregnant and starts to dismiss her. An angel appears to him in a dream and says, do not be afraid. Mary is concerned about this unplanned pregnancy. An angel appears to her and says, do not be afraid. On one occasion, Jesus is calling people to follow him. He calls out to Simon. What do you think he says to Simon? Join me. Do not be afraid. When Jesus is teaching a crowd, he understands their anxiety about the unpredictability of life. And to ease their anxiety, he says, do not be afraid. On the Sunday morning after Jesus is crucified, the women go to the empty tomb. He's not there. The messenger says to the women, do not be afraid. God has proven to be a source of strength to countless numbers of people over the centuries. These 4 words remind us that we're not alone. The words do not wipe away the emotional distress, but such encouragement can make the difference between failure and success. The words, do not be afraid, also remind us to dig deeply into our soul for courage. Now, it's not as if God suddenly infuses us with a burst of bravery. But if we have a history with God, if we have nurtured our spiritual connection over the ages and built a foundation throughout the years, and if we have survived difficult times in the past because of our faith, then the phrase, do not be afraid, is a lot more than an empty promise. Telling ourselves that the present situation is hopeless will surely hasten our crumbling. Challenging ourselves to face our trial with courage can boost our confidence and generate a passion to conquer any giant standing in our way. If you live long enough, you will face a personal giant. When you do, will you have nurtured a strong foundation of faith that will see you through the battle? And not to be forgotten, we face many giants in our society today. Widespread poverty, terrorism, strained race relations, homophobia, xenophobia. What are we going to do about these Goliaths? Will we sneak back behind the lines and hope that someone else will go out and do battle for us? Or will we summon the courage to do what is right and fight for what is just for all people?